All right, so welcome everyone. Happy Aloha Friday. As I mentioned last week, I had thought about doing sourdough, not realizing it's Mother's Day, so it's not really the kind of thing that you can bang out today for mom this weekend. I should have done a Jello mold, but anyways, we'd already done the starter and I wanted to wrap this up. So happy Mother's Day early to all you moms out there. Hope you can find some flowers or some flowers find their way to you. I've seen people carrying them around. I have the ingredients here. First thing I want to do is get the bread mixing because of the process, and we want to get it mixed so I can show you the finished mixed dough. And then I'll come back and talk about ingredients, show you some of the sample stuff that we've already done. I should be able to shape a little bit and show some different pans and ways that you can approach it. So the recipe that you have calls for sourdough starter, and the process to make it is a little bit long. It takes about a week. The one that we started last week is I had in the refrigerator, and I've just been feeding it over the course of the week and making bread. So what this particular recipe calls for is the sourdough starter, which I have here. Of course, flour and water and salt. Those are really the primary ingredients. For this one, I'm adding a little bit of yeast so that you can get some leavening. Traditional sourdough doesn't really need it. It can rise on its own from the natural yeasts that are in the air. I also added a pinch of sugar, well, not a pinch, about a tablespoon, and then a little bit of fat. And in this case, I'm using oil, but I also put on the recipe that you could use softened butter as well. So you can use olive oil, whatever type of oil that you want. There are lots of different mixing methods for bread. We're gonna go with basically what's called the straight dough method, where everything kind of goes in the bowl at one time, and then we mix it together. So that's like the easiest, simplest way, and you still end up with a great bread at the end. So I'm gonna move it over here. Hopefully you can still see it. Here's my bowl. I have the dough hook. If you're using a stand mixer, always use your dough hook, not the paddle, and definitely not the whip. The whip will bend and snap and break off. You need the stiff, one-armed dough hook. This can be done by hand. I think I've made bread by hand maybe 6 times in my life. There's a lot of work to it, and I'm always in production, so it's about producing large quantities in a very rapid method. But there's nothing wrong with doing what we're doing at home by hand. It's no problem. I always recommend you put the wet ingredients in first. That would be, in this case, the sour and the water. So my starter is pretty thick. You can sort of see how it sticks. So you want to scrape out that 1 cup, get as much of it out as possible. And I'll usually rinse off my spatula and even my cup with a little bit of water. Just so we can try to get as much of that in there as possible. The sugar, the salt, and the yeast. And I'm going to talk to you about the type of yeast, but this particular one can go into dry ingredients, but I always recommend, this is a little tip, put it with the water and give it a little stir. Even though it will dissolve with dry, just to be safe, if you're making a dough that's not on the really hydrated or wet side, it makes sure that the yeast dissolves, and you don't want little pieces of undissolved yeast in your final product. So I drop that in and I just give it a little stir. And that's all you'll need. And that way you make sure that that yeast gets hydrated. A little bit of oil. This is just corn oil. I'm out of olive oil, or I probably would have put olive oil in there. And that's optional, not necessary, but I like a little bit of fat in my bread. And then the flour. I got 5 cups of flour here. And this is all purpose. Most of your bread recipes. But the first thing you want to do is add the liquid. In this case, of course, just water. And I'll usually stir in the water to sort of thin out the batter. Basically what this is. And if you have it at home, you should be able to smell it. It's very sour.
Chef Dan, I am so sorry. The internet on campus like totally went like blacked out. And I think we kind of missed what was in the bowl. So I went out, and I think I don't know if because I'm the host, everyone went out. I'm not sure. Can we just explain what you're doing right now?
Yeah, absolutely. This is just the sourdough that I started earlier. Well, I had it in the fridge, but I made a larger batch so that if people want to come and get some, then they can. You can skip all those steps of feeding it and creating your own over a week. I can give you a cup, and then you can start feeding it yourself. It'll be good to go. So it's just that sour. It's simple water and flour that I've been feeding and mixing every day, twice a day for the last few days. And now I'm feeding it again. So again, in goes the water to thin it out a little bit, and then I mix in some flour. And that will feed the yeast. Because what happens is the yeast eats the protein in the flour, and then after it's eaten all of it and it's gone, there's nothing left for it to eat. So it'll bubble up and rise up, and then it'll settle, and you have to come back and feed it. So this will go in the fridge today, and I'll only have to feed it once a week. But you can't leave it sit forever because it'll run out of, it slows down, but it'll still end up dying all the yeast. But you can pull it out and refeed it, maybe even a tiny pinch of yeast to get it back to life, and you'll be good to go. So you just mix it until all of the flour is incorporated, no lumps, cover it, put it in the refrigerator, and you're good to go for the sourdough. And this dough is, and the recipe that I gave you mixes for about 7 minutes. What you want is a nice smooth dough at the end. The range actually could probably be from 7 to 15, but if you're using a stand mixer like this, probably 7 minutes would be fine. If you're doing it by hand, it's probably going to take you 15 minutes to get a nice, smooth, elastic dough. So kneading it probably, I would say about 150 times, roughly, but you'll have to look at the texture, and I'll show you that in a second. And then here's a way to store it. I recommend just a plastic container. I try to stay away from glass, so if you get plastic, quart container, quart and a half, up to 2 quarts, depending on how much you're making. And then you just dump this into a bowl, feed it, and then put it back in. Take out what you need, of course. So you'll have that. And then here's the yeast that I recommend. It's very difficult to find fresh compressed yeast, Cape yeast they call it. It's alive, it has to be refrigerated. What most people work with today is the dry yeast. And this is dry yeast, both of these. This is a SAF Instant, SAF-Instant brand. This is the one I recommend. This particular brand, Fleischmann's, has been around a long time as well. It's a dry instant yeast also. I think this has been here as long as I've been at Windward. I'm still using it up, and that's almost a year and a half ago. So this will last for, like I said, almost forever in the freezer, and for a couple years on the dry shelf. What you want to make sure you do is get the one that says instant, because there is a dry yeast that has to be dissolved in water, and you don't want, if you get the one that has to be dissolved in water, it just adds an extra step to your process. So you would basically do exactly what I did here, but you would have to make sure that it's mixed in and dissolved really well. So this is really your key ingredient for when you get into the bread making process. So I would recommend, like I said, the SAF Instant one. It's about $2.50 for a pound, and a pound will last you forever. You can open this up, pour it into a jar, or put it in a Tupperware, and just store it in the freezer, is what I would say.
Chef, I have one question.
Yeah.
Why stay away from glass to store starter? Can they use mason jars?
Yeah, you can use anything really as non-reactive. So if you can use glass, you can use tough plastic, you can use stainless steel. Most of the things that I see online are glass, and I think that's, just like I said, I think the other week about baking and Pyrex. Glass is popular for home use, but it's against health regulations in professional settings, so I tend to never use it. But the only risk you run there is, of course, dropping it or hitting it and breaking it. So if you have a 50-year-old starter in your glass jar and you drop it, and jar breaks, there's no way to save it. Whereas if you drop it with a Tupperware stainless steel container, then you can save it. So that's the only thing to think about there. All right, and then the dough's mixed, and it will be a little bit sticky. You can see it will shape into, it's going to stick a little bit to your hands, but not too much. It turns out really good. That recipe, it took me about 5 or 6 tries to scale it down and get it to a batch that comes out just perfect. So that recipe should work for you without fail. And now what we have to do is rest this dough, right? So it's just had a workout. It's just like you, right? With Zumba, what is that, on Tuesday or Wednesday or whenever it is, right? After your muscles get a workout, they need to rest and relax. This dough is the same way. So it's just had a workout. It's tight and it needs to relax so that we can shape it into the loaves that we want. So if you're not using this bowl again, you can simply cover this. If you're using the bowl again for something else, then you can take just another stainless steel bowl, something like this, roughly the same size, or a glass bowl or a plastic bowl. Lightly spray it, and then drop your dough inside. Turn it over so it gets a thin coating of oil on top so it doesn't crust. Cover it and let it rest in a nice, safe, warm place. And that takes about 90 minutes. And I have one here that's rested. So you can see this one's rested already. Hopefully you can see that. It's relaxed and it's actually risen a little bit. So in that 90 minutes, you end up with the yeast going to work on the proteins in the flour. It's eating that sugar. Yeast loves sugar, and it's releasing the gas, so it's allowing it to rise and relax. So we're jumping ahead basically 90 minutes from where you would be. And then I'm just going to work it here. Hopefully you guys can see this. Because it is a little sticky, you always want to dust a little bit of flour. And then take it out either by hand. You may want to use a spatula. And you can find these bowl scrapers online or at Chef's Zone, some of your kitchen stores, maybe even the supermarket in the houseware section. These work great for scraping out doughs, all in one shot. So you can see I can take that out, drop it here, and then I'm basically just folding it into a sphere, making a ball, or what we call a boule, and folding it in on itself. So there's a couple of ways to do it. If it's a smaller loaf, you can do it upside down and turn it like this, almost like a roll. If it's a larger one, bigger than this, you would use both hands on your counter and just kind of work it in a circle. And using your bottom of your hand, tucking in the bottom part of it. So it makes a nice tight loaf. So we've done our mixing, we've done our bulk fermentation. Now we've knocked it down and we've shaped it. If the recipe that you made, which gives you about 2 1/4 ounces of, 2 1/4 pounds of dough. If you want to make 2 loaves, you can. If you want to make 1 large one, you can. It's up to you. But I probably wouldn't go less or any more than 2 loaves. And I'll show you what sizes those are. Because keep in mind that when we take this dough and we put it into a pan, it is going to double in size before it goes into the oven. When it comes out of the oven, it's going to grow even more. So it looks kind of small right now, but it's going to end up being pretty good size. Enough to last a couple days.
Chef, I have a question.
Yeah.
I know this was kind of a couple steps back, but you sprayed the bowl. Was the spray to prevent from sticking?
Yeah, well, it can prevent the sticking. It wouldn't be a huge problem here, but primarily what it does is it allows you to take like this. You can see how I've spread it. Now let's say this just came out of the mixer and I shaped it into a bit of a ball. I drop it top side down and then The top now has a layer of oil on it, and I flip it over. So that creates just a thin skin of oil to prevent it from crusting and drying. Once you get your bread dough mixed, the last thing you want to have happen is have it exposed to air. If we leave this out, let it sit even 15 minutes, it'll get a crust on it. And then you go to shape it, and that crust gets mixed into the dough, and it affects the texture. It won't ruin it, but it just doesn't create the texture that you'd want if you were selling it, for example. So that's the main reason for that, yeah. But likewise, you would take like a pan. If we're going to use this now to pan and get ready to proof and bake it, we do the same thing here, a little light spraying. If you have a non-stick pan, that works fine. This would have risen, I take it out, I shape it whatever I want. And here I don't have to go upside down and flip it because I'm going to get ready to bake it. So this is now panned and it's ready to go into a nice warm place to be proofed, but remember, you still need to cover it. And I think plastic wrap works fine. A little bit of plastic wrap over the top. You don't press it too tight because you don't want it to stick too much. Just gently cover it. And this will probably take, depends on how warm it is, 30 minutes to an hour or so to rise and double in size. And I have one here. Look at that. Ready to go. See my little Post-it note. And you can see how I covered it here. Just a little bit of plastic wrap. I'm going to use this one here. You know, within about an hour, this will be ready to go into the oven. So I'll just set this aside. And now this one has risen. It's doubled in size. And that's really the trick. So when you let your bread rest from the mixing, let it double in size. When you shape it and put it into whatever pan or tray that you wish to bake it on, again, let it double in size because you will have knocked the air out of it by shaping it. Once it's doubled in size, nice and soft, be gentle with it. Now it's ready to get prepped for the oven. And for that, I'm just gonna dust a little bit of flour on top. And I just take like a paring knife. Make sure it's really sharp, or you can use a serrated knife. And you just need a couple cuts in the dough. And you want to go in maybe 1/4 of an inch. And there's some great videos online for techniques for this. Most of your professional bakers will actually use a razor blade, and they have a special tool that goes in to cut at an angle to really get into the bread. So it's not super deep. That's just something that's going to give you a little bit of a pattern. And you can get creative. Another thing you can use is scissors. I'll show you a loaf where I just took scissors and snipped at an angle and then baked it. What this does is it allows the bread to rise a little bit more, right? So you basically created these areas for the expansion to work a little bit better. Whereas if you put it in whole and the heat hits the outer crust, what's going to happen to the outer crust? It's going to get baked first, and it is going to become hard, and then it'll slow down the ability for it to expand. We want to create an area for it to expand. Plus, it looks really nice once it's baked. So that's one style of cutting it.
Chef, I have a question.
Yeah.
Is it okay if someone uses a damp towel to cover?
Yeah,
no plastic?
absolutely. Damp towels, even a dry towel. In Hawaii, it's not a huge problem for us. Depends on when it is, right? But summer, when humidity's 90%, it's perfect for bread. A dry towel would work great. If you're in Nevada, you're in Vegas, it's 110 degrees with zero humidity, you probably would want the damp towel. Good question. So this one would be ready to go in the oven, and I'll bake that off. And then when it comes out, it will look like this. This one I did a different cut. I just did one cut on the side. And if this just came out of the oven, I would want to take some gloves or a pair of tongs and remove it from the pan. You don't want to sit in the pan to let it cool. it'll create condensation and you end up with a soggy bottom. Nobody wants a soggy bottom. So you take it out. And just put it on a cooling rack. And that'll allow the air to get underneath. It allows it to keep that nice crust on the bottom. And it takes probably about 30 minutes to cool before you can slice it. Remember the dough in the center, even though it's baked, it's still hot, it's steamy. If you try to cut it too early, you just sort of smash it. And you'll end up with a nice hard crust. And let me show you one other thing. Here's another technique that can be used, and you'll see this a lot. Most of your artisan bakeries, they'll use canvas. You can just use a dish towel or a linen towel. And if you put the towel in a bowl and dust the towel with flour, then you can proof it in a basket or in a bowl, and then turn it out onto a pan for a freeform style loaf. So I'll show you that. Hopefully. So I'm gonna just take this, I'm gonna put the pan upside down first, and then turn that over. Remove the bowl, that comes off easy because it didn't have any dough touching it. The dough was touching the towel. So the towel should come off. You know, I had a generous amount of flour on there. And you end up with a loaf again that's ready to cut however you want to score it. Maybe you just want 2 different ones. And if you wanted to, you could also come back and dust it again with a little bit of flour. A lot of people like that look, that artisan look. So as this bakes, it's going to be free form, so it might be a little bit more shallow. It won't have the straight sides, but it'll look a bit more rustic, and I'll show you one of those here in a second. So these are both ready to go in the oven. So here's a couple examples of the baked one. Freeform, this was a freeform baked one. You can see how it's a little bit flatter than the ones that would come out of a pan. That was just a basic scoring with a knife. Here's one I did with the scissors. So you can see I just took scissors and cut a couple snips, allowed it to expand a little bit. Some of these are 100% whole wheat. Some of the ones I made earlier in the week, I did all whole wheat. I did 50-50 whole wheat flour and regular flour. And then I did some with just 100% all-purpose flour. And that's up to you. You can vary your the flour that you use. It kind of just depends on what it is that you're looking for. You can also make more of an elongated shape. If you make this shape, cut your recipe, the dough that you make in half, and you'll end up with 2 of these. So I think Makana got some of the, or he got some the other day. I can't remember which one.
Guilty.
But I baked these off yesterday and sliced it. I think I mentioned I'm laying off carbs, or I was. I'm not anymore because I made bread all week, and I can't not try it when it comes out of the oven and it smells fresh and nice. So this is the same sort of process. You would just kind of make a football shape, put it on your pan, cover it, let it rise, double in the oven, and bake it.
Chef, I have a question.
Yes.
Can you use a pastry ring on a flat sheet to put your dough in?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And feel free to get creative. You can see, this is one of my favorite ways to bake bread. You find these baskets all over at Ben Franklin. I mean, I think I got these at Savers, a whole stack. I've been using these for years. They're very inexpensive. They have a nice pattern on them. And I just dusted that with flour. And then I put my dough upside down in it and covered it, let it rise. And when I baked it off, I ended up with a loaf that has this pattern. So I still score it, but it has kind of an artisanal, nice little pattern. Anything that you might find that you think would be interesting to put a pattern on your bread, feel free to do it. You just want to make sure it doesn't stick and that it doesn't have like pukas where the bread will rise through the puka and you won't be able to get it out of the basket. You know what I mean, right? And then this is basically about the full recipe for a size of bread. So if you're doing it in the toaster oven at home, which you can bake in, no problem if it has a bake setting, this is probably too big. You'd have to do smaller ones. If you're doing it at home in a regular full-size oven, any sort of shaped loaf will work for the recipe that you guys have. If you did want to make hand rolls, the little small kind rolls, you could do that. Just cut small pieces, roll them in balls, and maybe just put them in a pan so that they kind of come together, or separate them out and do them individually so that each of them has a crust all the way around. But it's not complicated. That's one of the things that I encourage people to do. I mean, bread, I love it. I've been baking forever, and it's super simple. It doesn't need to be complicated. If you want to skip the sourdough thing, you can go to the Uala Leaf Cafe YouTube page. We have like 3 videos. And one of them is for ciabatta bread, which is a really quick 7-minute mixing together, easy way to make a really good bread. As a matter of fact, there's also one on shortbread. So if you need to make cookies for mom this weekend, there's like a really short, simple, the easiest cookie in the world to make. There's a short video on how to make that. So I guess that's most of it. I don't know, are there any other questions?
Yes, Chef, I have a few questions, and I know we're running out of time, but here are a few questions, Chef. The first question is, are the baking times different for the different shapes?
Baking time is different for every oven, every person. So you just sort of have to watch it. What I recommend, and I think I put 385 on the recipe, we usually do it at 400, 425, but we watch it. And I think 385 is a good temp for you guys at home, depending on your oven, but just watch your bread. The thing you want to be careful of, you don't want the outside to get brown really quick, and then the inside's raw. So if you put the bread in at 500, it'll be golden brown in 7 minutes, but the inside's going to be raw. And if you go till the inside's cooked, the outside's going to be burnt. So you're really better off erring on the side of a little bit lower temp and a little bit longer. But if you make a small kind roll compared to this loaf, a roll might only take you 15 minutes, whereas this takes about 40 minutes, right? Roughly the same temperature.
And then going off of that question, Chef, someone asked, how do you know when it's done?
Usually we'll tap it. If you take a glove or your oven mitt and pick up the loaf and give it a tap. I don't know if you can hear this. It has a hollow sound, so it should sound hollow. The other tried and true method is if you have a thermometer, you can put a thermometer in it, and carbohydrates, starches are fully cooked at 200. So as long as the internal temperature of the bread is over 200 degrees, you know it's done. But normally we'd just take it and give it a tap. And if it sounds hollow, then you know that it's done.
I have another question, Chef. Does the recipe differ if you add garlic cloves or olives?
No. The only thing I would say, if you're going to add things, and I encourage that, get creative. Rosemary potato bread, olive bread. The thing you have to think about is salt, right? Most olives, if you're adding calamatas, they're pretty salty. I would scale back on the salt a little bit. Maybe cut your salt in half. If you're adding, say, to this recipe, probably 1.5 cups, 2 cups of olives, and just mix it in with the dough. If you're adding dried herbs and things like that, it doesn't really matter. Everything would be the same. Another technique people like here, in the pan that I had showed you, well, we make an herb bread where we put olive oil in the bottom of the pan, a pretty generous amount, maybe like 1/4 of an inch, and then we put the dough in that, and we proof it and bake it. It'll absorb all that olive oil, sort of almost fries around the outside, and that makes a delicious, really, really good bread. That's our focaccia style bread. But you can get creative, add anything you want. Just think about moisture content and think about whether or not you're adjusting or creating something that might be too salty. Those are really the only things you need to think about.
Thank you, Chef. And then last question that I have before we end is, someone missed, what was the third video on?
We have shortbread cookies, we have the ciabatta bread, and then Steve did one on rice cooker cooking, where when your rice is done in your rice cooker, you pop the lid and you put different items on top and close it really quickly, like a fillet of fish or spinach. I think he used, I wasn't here for that filming, but I think he used vegetables, grilled vegetables and some fish. He said leftovers. I wouldn't have said leftovers. So Steve, if you're watching, don't say leftovers. Although it can be leftovers. But if you pop the lid when your rice just finishes, and say you put a layer of fresh spinach and maybe 2 fillets of fish, depending on the size of your rice cooker, close it immediately and then let it sit for 30 minutes. And now while you're off doing something else, you come back, now you've got your vegetable, you've got your protein, and you've got your rice. So it's just a little trick for, cross-utilizing a tool that most of us use at home already. Come up with something different. So
awesome. Thank you so much, Chef Dan. We are out of time, unfortunately.
Sorry, I ran late. Let me just say that if you're on campus and you want some bread samples, come by. If you want a sourdough starter to get you going, if you plan to do this, just let me know. Come by. I can give you enough to get you started. So the main reason people are doing this now and it's so popular is because they have a lot of time on their hands. So in a lot of ways, I think that's a good thing that's coming out of this crisis that we're in. People are finding the time to do the things that they maybe have always wanted to do, but haven't had the time to do because we had really, really busy lives. So I would put this pretty high on your list. If you like bread, and don't be afraid of it. Bread is simple. Don't let people tell you it's complicated. Super simple. And you go to the potluck and you show up with something like this, and it's a lot cheaper than spare ribs. So it works good, right? So, all right. Thank you so much, you guys.